Blessings. Weather is warming up, feels like summer already. Tonight, being Tuesday, we have a few questions have come in about different aspects of the practice, so we'll endeavour to answer them. There's a question based on a reflection that thoughts and speech are not the same. And the questioner says, they face this issue. My speech, my words are not matching with my thoughts. After conversation, I realize that thoughts and speech expressed are not the same. I may feel remorse or guilty given a chance of opportunity to speak out. Can Luang Por kindly give a piece of advice or guidance? I may feel remorse or guilty given the chance to speak out. So anyway, yes, it's quite possible that we can say one thing and be thinking another. As you become more mindful, more aware, self-aware through the practice, you may pick up on that sometimes you are speaking perhaps to fulfill a social obligation. So you say what is expected in a situation, or sometimes maybe you're upset or even angry, but you don't wish to display that, so you say something that is not displaying anger. You may speak reasonably or say something more neutral, even though inside you feel angry. Sometimes, for different reasons, that people will say one thing meaning another, so they want something, but they say, I don't want it. So even monks have this problem, because we are working very hard to discipline ourselves, bring up mindfulness and work with desire, and so somebody may offer you something that you would like or want, but then you say no, because you want to teach yourself to let go of that desire or not to give in to the desire. So that's another example. There's many of these different examples you might think of where thought and speech are not matched, sometimes in a good way, like that, say for the monk who's trying to be restrained. So says no to something they would rather have. So the obvious one, would you like some more cake? No, when the mind is saying yes, but the words are saying no. Or whatever it is. Would you like to go on holiday to Bali? No, but maybe the mind does want to go, I don't know. Depends what your particular desires are. So sometimes it can be in a good way that you're trying to restrain the worst of your desires. You're speaking maybe politely to someone you would rather be rude to because you're angry. Could be another example. Sometimes the inner mood and the words kind of fuse a bit, so somebody is angry with another person and you see them sort of gritting their teeth and say, I wish you well, when they don't really mean it, but they're trying their best not to give in to their mood. So there's all kinds of situations where maybe you're thinking one thing and say another. As I said, maybe just social convention requires you to speak when you don't particularly want to say anything, but you feel you have to. But one of the practices we're developing, following the Buddhist path, is development of awareness of the truth and practicing right speech. So right speech is speech that is true and honest, coming from a place of goodwill, kindness. It's useful, it's said in the right way, with the right words, in the right place at the right time. These are all practices that we learn and develop through experience. We get better at it. And you learn sometimes it's best just to stay quiet. Sometimes, in a situation, you may be thinking something, but you don't want to put those words, you don't want to articulate them because they'll provoke someone, maybe who's getting upset, angry, or they'll confuse someone, or they're the wrong thing to say at the wrong time. We all know this. In the world of entertainment, and that comedy is often based around this kind of thing. But you're aiming to speak the truth, speak that which is useful, and coming from a place of kindness. So sometimes your thoughts are playing catch up with that. As I've just mentioned, maybe your thoughts are still more unwholesome, but you're trying to say something that is skillful, wholesome. The idea is one day your thoughts and your speech become in sync, and your thoughts are wholesome because you're already abandoning the unskillful, the unwholesome thoughts. And then if you have to speak, you speak. If there's no need to speak, you don't speak. But what you say, if you do speak, is true, to the point, helpful, kind. And this is the speech of an Arya Pugla, one who has experienced at least the first level of enlightenment, or maybe an arahant. And they have much more mastery over their mind. And their speech matches that, so then they'll be mindful in a situation and say something that's appropriate for that situation. They won't lie, they won't say something that is out. They're not speaking to hurt somebody, display aggression, abuse someone. But until we've reached that level of practice where our mindfulness is strong and continuous, we're not forgetting ourselves. Until we've reached that point, then we have to accept we sometimes make mistakes, or sometimes we're using restraint and we have an inner mood that is not very wholesome. We're confused, or greedy, or worried, or we have one of the biases in the mind. So we might be fearful, angry, greedy, or deluded. But we're working to keep precepts so we're not displaying it through our speech. And a lot of practice, especially in the beginning, is based around that, restraining the worst of our moods, the inner moods that are maybe not very wholesome, but we're mindful enough, aware enough not to display them through our speech or our actions. But as you train yourself more and practice more, it gets easier, more relaxed, more natural. And you recognize skillful speech, unskillful speech, you know the difference. Your mindfulness and your reflective ability is keeping up with a situation. So it's not so hard, and you're just more careful what you say. And if you haven't got anything good to say, well, you don't say anything, perhaps. As the Buddha encouraged, if you're speaking and tend to say things that will improve a situation, but if there's nothing to say, you just don't bother, maybe you stay quiet. But your mind is thinking in the same way. It's no longer just restraining greed or anger or fear. your mind is actually in sync with your speech. That's your goal. If you meet an arahant, sometimes they don't say what you expect them to say. They don't waste time with chit-chat about idle matters, or they may display very great compassion or kindness at a time when you might think they wouldn't. You see this sometimes. Some very great monks I've lived with, at a time where someone is being very provocative, difficult, unpleasant in their behavior, the enlightened monk still meets them with kindness and compassion, tolerance. So I've seen that with Lumpur Anand sometimes, because he has many, many monks studying with him, visiting him, many lay people studying with him, visiting him. Once in a while there'll be somebody who's not very well behaved and can be quite rude. But he always meets them with great tolerance, kindness, and at a time when you think he might be tempted to be very critical or say something negative towards the rude person, actually says something very kind, even though they're not responding very well. And that's very inspiring to see. Or humility as well. Sometimes the spiritual practitioner, maybe not an enlightened monk, just anybody who's practicing and has been practicing, they may display great humility. So somebody praises them, but they're humble and they don't display conceit or attachment to the praise, or they may sort of shake it off, acknowledge it but not make much out of it. Or sometimes when somebody is being very negative and criticizing them, the person with humility maybe says, yes, you're right. And it may not be actually that true what the person who's criticizing is saying, but in that situation, the practitioner is being humble and displaying a lack of ego, so they just agree, or they say something very soft. So I like the one Lumpur put going into the village, and the little boy saying, "Oh, here comes the monk, but he's a fake monk," sort of poking his ego, as it were. And he was about to get angry, but then he thought, but if I get angry, I'm really not acting like a monk. I would be a fake monk if I got angry, so I'll just have to be very patient with this. So he just smiled at the little boy. That kind of situation, when you bring up your mindfulness and you display humility, then that might be reflected in your speech. And instead of getting upset or angry, you display the Dhamma in terms of humility, kindness. But the Buddha said, the more you practice mindfulness, the more you will remember your conversations that you had, say through a day. Maybe at the end of the day, as part of your Dhamma practice, you might reflect on what you've said through the day, the conversations you've had from morning till evening. Think about what you said. Was it true? Was it not? Was it said with mindfulness, or said out of a rush of emotion, carelessly? Was it said with kindness or anger? Was it helpful or not? These kind of reflections as you practice mindfulness, even though you're not always fully mindful during a conversation, afterwards you can at least learn something, and then you adjust, and you maybe say, I'm not going to say that again. Often we get burnt, we say the wrong thing, we get hurt, and then but you learn your lesson and you say, I won't say that again. So if a similar situation arises, you know what to do now. You say, I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to stir that person up or provoke them, or just put it a different way or something. So we can learn after the event, reflect back on our speech, and as mindfulness improves, then We're right on top of speech, the thought formations, and then what's appropriate to say in a situation. And this comes through experience. We just have to keep at it, keep working at it until we stop saying those things that we regret. Next question. Is mindfulness and yoniso manasikara the same thing? Clearly not, because they don't sound the same, do they? Mindfulness is the usual translation for sati. But sati, mindfulness, can also be translated as recollection, keeping in mind, not forgetting. Yoniso manasikara means wisely reflecting, or reasoned reflection, wise thinking. So it's more the wisdom aspect of the mind, thinking things through, coming to an understanding by reasoning, thinking. And literally, the language of yoniso manasikara means going back to the source, back to the origin. So it's thinking things through, looking at cause and effects. This has arisen because of that. This depends on this depends on that. It's understanding the conditioned nature of experience, whether we're talking about our mind or the world around us, using thought as a skillful tool to understand things. But yoniso manasikara depends on mindfulness. Otherwise it just degenerates into endless thinking without wisdom guiding it. It's just the chatter of the mind, often pointless, frivolous, or going round in circles, prone to doubt, to worry, to various mental defilements and hindrances taking it over, unskillful thought. But yoniso manasikara is skillful thought, so it needs mindfulness as well. We need to be paying attention and directing the mind to try and know and understand something. So monks, for example, we have these reflections, wisely reflecting, I eat alms food, I wear my robe, I use my lodging, I use medicine. So what we call the basic necessities, 4 basic necessities for living in the world, and lay people, you need them as well. You reflect on them. Why do I eat? What is food? What is this process of eating? What goes on? I chew, I digest, I send the waste back out into the world. How much do I need to eat? Where did the food come from? Who provided it? All these kind of simple reflections are what we call yoniso manasikara with regards to food. That requires some mindfulness because you need to be paying attention to do that. And lay people can reflect in just the same way. Why do I eat? Where does the food come from? Why do I eat? How much should I eat? This process of eating, what's happening here? Food is going into the body, keeping the body healthy, and then we excrete the waste out. Getting to know the truth of eating, for example, as opposed to when we're not wisely reflecting and we're not mindful, we may just eat following our desires. I like this, I don't like that, and we indulge our desires. That's different, that's following kilesa. So the practice of mindfulness and wise reflection go together to defeat kilesa, as it were, to change our mind so we have right view. Yoniso manasikara supports the arising of right view. And with that, we're learning about life, and particularly where suffering and stress comes from and how to abandon it. So mindfulness is like the vehicle, wisdom or yoniso manasikara is like the driver of the vehicle. They depend on each other to go places together. So you need to be mindful of something. So if it's eating, you need to be paying attention to the eating. You need to be mindful. and then you can wisely reflect on what you're doing. Or it may be precepts like the first question about speech, to be able to keep the precepts of not lying, not abusing others, practicing right speech. You need to pay attention to your speech. You pay attention, you're bringing up mindfulness of speech, and then you're reflecting wisely on what's going on. And if you're creating suffering for yourself or others, regret, remorse, wise reflection will notice that and say, to free yourself from this remorse, don't say it, don't speak like that. Change the way you speak, perhaps. So mindfulness and wisdom, they go together, and the end result is freedom from suffering, preventing suffering arising, or helping you to abandon suffering that has arisen. So these are the tools of the Buddhist practitioner, working together to help us do things better, to think better, speak better, act better. And this isn't just in meditation, but just in daily life. These are the tools of the practitioner, and we use them all the time. Next question. How important is it to offer dana? Very important. It's an essential part of the practice, and everyone who has followed the Buddhist path all the way to enlightenment, including the Buddha himself, has practiced dana. Dana means giving, sharing, generosity. And it's the antidote to attachment, possessiveness, stinginess, greed. So it's one of the, stinginess is one of the qualities that one abandons on attaining stream entry. The stream enterer and other enlightened beings up to the Arahant, they no longer have stinginess or possessiveness. So, they already the Sotapanna, he or she hasn't completely abandoned greed, so there may be still indulgence in pleasure or desire for pleasure. But basic stinginess has been abandoned. They're no longer trying to accumulate the things of the world because they know they're impermanent, they're not self. So one reflection I've used a lot, and many practitioners I know use, is when you die, what do you take with you from this world? You don't take anything. You don't even take your body, let alone material things, people, things. You can't take anything with you. So it all has to be abandoned eventually. So you might as well start abandoning it now. And one very good way to abandon things is practice generosity. Share, give away. The Buddhist practice is about letting go, giving up, giving away, sacrifice, helping, sharing. It's not about accumulating. Doesn't mean to say it's necessarily wrong to accumulate wealth or pleasurable experiences through your life, but beware, because they tend to generate greed. So the practice of generosity, charity, sharing is directly countering that, and it supports meditation in the sense it's leading on to what we call nekkhamma, the giving up of attachment to sensuality, desiring pleasant sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and even pleasurable fantasies and the anticipation of pleasure in the mind. When you meditate, you're seeing through that, you're giving up the attachment to that, and the practice of dana and sharing helps you there. Strangely enough, lay people practice a lot of dana. You couldn't have sangha in the world. Monks and nuns couldn't survive without the generosity of lay people, and obviously it's not just Buddhists who practice generosity. People all over the world help each other in many ways, practice charity, giving, sharing with family, and then even out in society with total strangers. And that's one of the beautiful things about humanity, and you can witness generosity taking place every day of the week, anywhere in the world. It's happening. That's a great thing. But funnily enough, sometimes it's Sangha who appreciate it most of all, because our whole lifestyle and livelihood is dependent on alms, with an L, A-L-M-S. The generosity, the generous gifts of the laity. And you can't help but notice that because every day people share food with you. Whether you're in the monastery, you're going out into the village, the town, people share food. That's how you survive. So you become very aware of that, and you're very appreciative of the generosity of the lay community, the robes you wear, all the help you get, because you have no money or material income. You require, or you depend on the generosity of people. But you can't ask for it. It has to be freely given, volunteered. So you really appreciate it when you get given food, material help, like given robes or a lift or some material help in some way. Because you know that's how you can survive as a monk, and so you really appreciate it. And you really appreciate how it's supporting you all the way through your practice, maybe all the way to Nibbana. And the Buddha depended on the alms, the generosity of lay people, as have all the arahants. So the more you practice as a Sangha member, the more you appreciate it, and that's why you might encourage people to practice it. You know it's good for them. Obviously it's good for the Sangha. You could say there's some self-interest there. But it's good for the laity because it's supporting them in letting go. Just now I mentioned Lumpur Put, who is a teacher of the same generation of Ajahn Chah, coming from the same town, and Lumpur Put had many good teachings. I remember one story he told me when I was a young monk. I met him quite a few times, and he said when he was a novice monk, he became a novice monk when he was a teenager. And when you're a monk, you eat your food in an alms bowl. You go out, you collect food, you come back to the monastery, maybe you eat, and when you finish your meal, you wash your bowl. And usually in those days that meant just going out into the forest, the jungle, onto the floor. Maybe you rest your bowl on some leaves or straw. You wash it with water from a well, clean it, and sometimes there's a little bit of food left over, but not always, because sometimes you've got very little food. When you're washing your bowl, because there's a little bit of smell from the few rice grains you might have left over, then quite often it will attract animals, like squirrels come down from trees, stray dogs wander through. And he was washing his bowl one day. He's just a teenager, a boy, and a stray dog came looking for scraps of food, and he didn't have any. He'd eaten all his food that day. It's finished, so he's washing his bowl, and this dog wasn't just stray, it's like skinny. It was on its last legs. It was literally wobbling and falling over. It was so weak. So it came up to him looking for food, and he thought, oh, no food left today. He had absolutely nothing to give the dog. So he felt very sorry, very compassionate for this starving dog. So he actually took his finger, stuck it down his throat, vomited up his meal, and you only have one meal a day. So he vomited his food onto the ground, and the dog very happily ate it all up, because the dog was starving and on death's door. So the dog survived. Lumpur Put went without a meal for the day. He was only a teenager, but he was happy to do that. So he sacrificed the food from his stomach back to the dog. The dog got a meal, the dog survived, and the dog was very friendly to him after that. He would follow him around, come to see him every day. And Lumpur Put said from that day on, his entire life, and he lived to a ripe old age, almost 90, he never once went without a meal. Because occasionally as a monk, you're in a situation where you don't get a meal. Maybe you don't meet anyone to offer you food when you're traveling or walking into some places on alms round. It's not guaranteed you'll get a meal every day. But he said he never once went without a meal, and he actually always had too much food. And very good quality food as well. He said he was always offered the best food wherever he went. And he said, he contemplated it and he said, this is the result of sacrificing this meal for the dog, saving the dog's life. And it wasn't he was thinking, oh, this is going to help me for the rest of my life. He was just reflecting that's actually what the result was. So you practice generosity like this, it helps you, supports you in your spiritual practice. It's not that you're expecting anything in return, and you should try not to, because that's another form of greed. But as you practice generosity, it will come back to you and support you when you need it, when you need material help, spiritual help, guidance, teachings. It will all come back to you. So don't be afraid to make good karma by practicing generosity, and ideally practice it every day in one way or another. Obviously we help family and friends quite often anyway, but maybe help strangers, do charity, help those who are in need, support the Sangha, support monks and nuns, whatever. Keep practicing generosity and you'll find it really helps your Dhamma practice. There's a question in Thai. So maybe I'll just quickly go through it in Thai first. หลวงพ่อครับมีคำถามจะขอเรียนถามครับถ้าเรายึดมั่นในมงคลสูตรข้อที่หนึ่งไม่ขอคบคนพาลคือคนเห็นแก่ตัวคนที่มีใจเป็นมิจฉาทิฏฐิแล้วมันจะขัดกับหลักเมตตาธรรมไหมครับถ้าเราไม่คุยไม่เสวนากับคนเหล่านี้เราจะขาดเมตตาไหมครับ I'll just answer in Thai เมตตาเป็นความคิดดีเป็นอารมณ์ดีเป็นอารมณ์กรรมฐานของเราที่เราส่งให้ตัวเองก่อนแล้วก็ออกไปสู่โลกทุกภพทุกภูมิทุกคนไม่ยกเว้นเราพยายามสร้างเมตตาแบบตามพระพุทธเจ้าหาประมาณไม่ได้เราคิดเมตตาก่อนแต่ถึงเรามีเมตตาเราก็ยังเลือกคบคนได้ถ้าเรารู้คนนี้เป็นคนที่จะนำปัญหามาให้หรือคนที่ไม่มีศีลไว้ใจไม่ได้หรือคนที่หวังไม่ดีกับเราจะมาทำลายเราเรามีสิทธิ์เลือกที่จะไม่คบเรายังมีเมตตาต่อเขาให้อภัยเขาหวังดีต่อเขาแต่ถ้าเขาสร้างปัญหามากมายเราก็หลีกเลี่ยงก็ได้ไม่ผิดแต่ยังให้หลีกเลี่ยงด้วยเมตตาไม่หลีกเลี่ยงด้วยโทสะเราต้องสังเกตรู้จักใจของตนคือมีเมตตาไม่คบคนพาลได้เราสงสารคนพาลหวังให้เขาดีขึ้นเปลี่ยนนิสัยแต่ไม่ต้องไปยุ่งกับเขามากถ้ายังต้องทำงานกับเขาหรือเกี่ยวข้องกับเขาเราก็รักษาอารมณ์เมตตาไว้แต่ระวังเพราะว่าถ้าเขาไม่มีศีลหรือมีมิจฉาทิฏฐิก็อาจจะมีเป็นเหตุที่เขาจะนำปัญหานำความทุกข์มาให้ก็เลยต้องระวังคบเฉพาะจำเป็นไม่จำเป็นก็ไม่ต้องคบนี่เป็นหลักปฏิบัติคือเราพยายามมีเมตตาทุกคนพวกความโกรธไม่มีประโยชน์กับเราไม่มีประโยชน์กับคนอื่นแต่จะคบไม่คบอันนี้อีกเรื่องหนึ่งอันนี้เป็นเรื่องของปัญญาที่จะพิจารณาประโยชน์ในการคบหาสมาคมกับคนอื่น So the question was, in the Mangala Sutta, we chant the Paritta, or that the Buddha gave. There's the very first verse that people tend to remember most because it's the first. It's Asevana cha balanang panditana cha sevana. Avoid associating with fools or heedless people, but do associate with the wise, good people. So basic teaching the Buddha gave when the Devas asked the Buddha what are the blessings of life. So he gave these 38 blessings. So the question is, does that the Buddha also taught us to have kindness, loving kindness for others. So if you are following this first teaching not to associate with fools, heedless people, don't spend time with them, avoid them, does that mean you're not practicing metta or goodwill for them? Well, it doesn't have to be. You can avoid someone and still wish them well. You can have metta for someone that you're not seeing and not spending time with and not speaking to. You can also not speak to someone or not spend time with someone out of aversion as well. So that's part of your practice, isn't it? To reflect on your intention and cultivate goodwill and abandon ill will. But whether you mix with someone, you spend time with them, you socialize with them, you make friends with them, you spend time with them, you have some choice there, don't you? And you can avoid someone and maintain your metta. Of course, some people you might not wish to spend time with, but you have no choice. Could be a family member or a work colleague. Even more so, you should keep your metta when you're with them, goodwill, because there may be someone who tempts you to get angry, annoy you, provoke you. So you have to practice keeping your metta when you're with those kind of people. If you have no choice. But where you have a choice, well, maybe you can choose to spend less time with people that maybe don't keep sila, don't have right view, they have some bad habits, and they may want you to follow their bad habits. So if someone keeps saying, let's go for a drink and get drunk, well, maybe you say, no thanks. You wish them well, you hope one day maybe they'll give up their habit of drinking. You don't have to look down on them or be averse to them. You can keep goodwill, but you don't necessarily have to follow them. Or maybe someone says, let's go hunting or fishing, but you don't want to kill. So you say, no, I won't go with you, but you still wish them well. And wishing them well in that situation, maybe you wish that they change their habit and give up hunting or fishing. So you can still have metta for somebody who's doing a lot of unskillful things. They have negative speech habits, they're selfish, self-centered kind of person, they break the law, they do all kinds of things. You can still wish them well because that's the wish that they will change for the better, but you don't necessarily have to spend your time with them or follow their example. So metta and wisdom, they work together. And as you're involved with society, you meet many kinds of people, so you sometimes you have to choose who you associate with, who you spend time with. Another question. Luang Por, why do some people die and then come back to life? And where do they go before they wake up? Well, my first answer to this is usually, I haven't died yet, so I'm not really qualified to say. But I have met one or two people who have had these near-death or temporary death experiences and come back. And probably the most common one that I've heard is people who die or conk out on the operating table in the operating theatre during surgery, and the heart stops, everything stops. And it seems very common, they sort of have this experience, the mind floats out of the body and is looking back at their body lying on the table, the doctors are around, and then later they come back and join the body again, the mind returns, the heart starts pumping again, and they wake up. And they can remember all kinds of things that happened during the operation that they shouldn't have known about because they were under anesthetic, and yet they can. It's as if once the mind is out, it's as if the ears are still working, the eyes are still seeing. So it's an interesting reflection on the mind and how the senses work. You know, the mind can still be sensitive to things even if it's not in the body. And obviously meditators also have this experience, and they're not dead, but when you're meditating and you go into deep samadhi, your body metabolism does slow down, your breath slows, becomes very refined, and there's a stillness to body and mind. And sometimes people have an out-of-body experience. They can see themselves, see other people. I knew one monk who could do this regularly. He'd go for a little float around the neighbourhood. But just as in the Buddha's past life, this monk was caught by his own kilesas, because of course this isn't yet a sign that you're necessarily enlightened or anything. You may still have greed, anger and delusion. It just means you have some samadhi maybe. So this monk did have samadhi, quite a good samadhi, and he went floating around the monastery, so he would know what people were doing and he'd tell them the next day, which was quite entertaining. But one day he thought, oh, I'm a bit bored floating around the monastery, so he floated off to the nearby town where we would go alms round. And on alms round he had noticed there's one young lady who would put food in the monks' bowls, who was generous but very good looking. And he remembered her, so he floated to her house. And he saw her having her evening bath, so he's a bit naughty. So he floated over, oh, she's having her bath. And because the desire came up in his mind, all the samadhi disintegrated immediately, and he went boom, right back into his body with a thud. And he couldn't do it again for a while because he had become overcome with lust, which just proves you that lust is a defilement. So meditators, that monk perhaps wasn't so skillful, but some who are skillful can use the outer body experience. But some people who are not meditators or not doing it in a controlled way have it, like when they're in an operation, and they may even die temporarily. And they often say the same things. They see light, move towards the light at the end of the tunnel. Occasionally, even near-death experiences, they see a heaven realm or other realms of existence. Sometimes they see other beings. And then they wake up and they can tell you all this. So basically the mind and the body are different things, aren't they? What we call nama and rupa. Rupa means physical form, nama means mentality or mind. And as you meditate, you become much more aware of the difference between body and mind. Even though they're linked and together in a human being, they are the different aspects of the human being, and it's possible to focus just on the mind, and the body becomes very still and kind of goes quiet, and you're just with the mind. And then you can reflect on the body and see it as impermanent, not self. So you can train yourself in meditation, and you're becoming much more aware of the difference between body and mind. So if someone has a near-death experience, their mind may just go away a little bit because they haven't reached their time to die. Their karma is not ripening for them to die. Well, they come back and they wake up. So I know monks who have had this experience. They've died temporarily, even seen a heaven realm, and then come back. And then they tell everyone, and they say, oh, you should believe more in heaven and hell, because they've seen it. Still, it's the word of another person, so you may believe or not. But there are those people who have had these experiences, and they seem to people are a little bit more open to at least listening to these experiences rather than just rejecting them. So it's just one more piece of information to reflect on, isn't it, in developing awareness of the difference between mind and body, and then also awareness of other realms of existence. As the Buddha said, there's heaven realms, hell realms, ghost realms, animal realms. Last question. You have mentioned Lumpur Buddha a few times. Can you tell us more about his life and practice, please? I think I may have talked about him a few years ago, but Lumpur Buddha died about 25 years ago at the age of around 100. He was considered to be an arahant. One of the reasons I remember him is because he became an arahant, fully enlightened, after just 4 years as a monk, which is quite amazing. He's not the only one, but it's a very fast progress in his practice. And he was very popular. He had very white skin, white hair. He was very twinkly dark, but twinkly eyes. So when you went to pay respects to him, which I was lucky enough to do a few times, he was quite a presence, an amazing ball of metta, just this metta energy, very powerful, good energy encompassing him. In his later years, he didn't speak a lot, as is quite common with very old monks. Few words, but amazing, good energy. So people would go and see him and feel very happy. On his birthday, sometimes 100,000 people would turn up. So a big birthday party. And he was generally loved and respected by all the monks in Thailand, whoever they were, whether they're study monks, meditation monks, whoever. He was well respected, and he himself had great mudita for other monks. He was always visiting other monks. So he visited Ajahn Chah many times. He liked to visit Ajahn Buddhadasa. He liked to visit other teachers. The monastery he lived in was in Singbury. Well, that was at the end of his life. He began his life in, if I remember, in Lopburi, which is near Singbury, in an area where they've had a lot of really good monks live and practice. He was born, can't remember what his parents did, maybe farmers, but the important thing is, from a very young age, when he was just a few years old and could speak, he could already remember his past lives very accurately. So there's an interesting story. His dad was, a firm dad, and he had a few children, 7 children, I think, and if anyone was naughty, he would hit them. So one day his dad was getting upset with him and hit him a few times. When he was about 10 years old, he ran out of the house saying, "Dad, you're a liar, you're a liar." And his dad had been scolding him for probably some mundane thing, sort of thing a little kid might do that's wrong and being naughty. So his dad said, "Why are you calling me a liar?" He ran out, wouldn't explain, just ran away from his dad. And then his mum went after him, got him, comforted him because he was crying. They said, "Why did you call Dad a liar?" He said, "Well, last life he was my big brother and he said he's going to follow me every life and look after me. Now he's hitting me, he's not keeping to his word." And his mum and dad knew he was already quite a special kid, so that kind of, he can remember past lives. So they accepted that. And he told them a few other things about family members and their past lives. So from a young age, it was accepted he could remember his past lives. And also as a teenager, he learnt to meditate, and by the end of his teens he'd attained jhana, he'd already attained deep states of samadhi. So he's obviously somebody who had done it before. And he said he'd been a monk for many, many lives. So he'd built up this skill with meditation. So from a young age he could meditate, he had psychic powers, he could remember past lives. But he also had other things to do in the early part of his life, and after he left school, he joined the army. He was in the army for a few years, and was always very popular. He's a very kind of kind person, popular person. And he didn't become a monk till he was about 28. And this is at the beginning of the 20th century. I can't remember the year, but 1912 or 1920, around the time of the First World War, either just before or just after. So a long time ago now, 100 years ago, he became a monk. He became a meditation monk. He ordained with the Dhamma sect, forest monk sect in Thailand. And he quickly gained skill in meditation because he had already been meditating as a layman. And after a couple of years, because his meditation was so good, he already had jhana, his teacher gave him permission to go off on what we call tudong, wandering, looking for a quiet place to practice. And he had a friend called Venerable Venerable Song, who became Lumpur Song, like Lumpur Buddha. They both became very famous enlightened monks. But he had this friend Lumpur Song, who was his kind of friend and supporter in wandering in the forest and meditating together. And they had a few stories. One story I remember, Lumpur Buddha was meditating in jhana, dead still in a cave. There was one cave in the Konsawan province that they would go to a lot. They said it was a very auspicious place and they had good meditation there. So they spent a lot of time in this cave meditating. Lumpur Buddha was sitting there and this centipede came up. And the centipedes in Thailand are like that big and they're really poisonous. If they bite you, it really hurts. For a couple of days you have a terrible pain. How can I say that? Because I was once bitten by a centipede. Anyway, the centipede came up onto Lumpur Buddha and he knew it, so he's meditating and he couldn't move, because if you move it tends to provoke them and they'll bite you very quickly. So it came up on him and it walked up, and went up onto his head and curled up and just sat on his head. So he's sitting there in meditation, he said he didn't dare breathe, move or anything. So he just sat there in samadhi with a centipede on his head. Luckily, after about half an hour or something, Ajahn Song came in and saw it. So very carefully got a piece of cloth, and put it next to the centipede. And again, I've done this before, they'll tend to walk onto the cloth. So he collected the centipede and took it outside the cave. And he said, very strange. This centipede had been sitting on a very well-practiced enlightened monk, and when he put it out on the ground, it started biting itself, and it bit itself to death and died there. He said, very unusual kind of experience. And there's a few other stories, not sure if I can remember them, but anyway, Lumpur Song and Lumpur Buddha practiced together, and Lumpur Buddha became enlightened first, became an arahant, and Lumpur Song suspected Lumpur Buddha was an arahant, so he would ask him questions. So he questioned him about his practice, how he had meditated, whether any kilesas were still arising, and he'd say, no more greed, anger and delusion are arising in my mind. And they lived together for many years and practiced together for many years. So Lumpur Song was always checking. So he was the first one to say he's enlightened, because he felt what Lumpur Buddha was saying is true. He'd practiced to the point where there's no more desire, no more wanting in the mind. And he said his mind is just empty. He's dwelling in emptiness. And this inspired Luang Por Song to practice harder, because if his friend has become enlightened, he wanted to do it, so he practiced, and after that he became enlightened as well. And because they were such good friends and supported each other in the practice, they said, we've got to stick together. So even though they didn't physically stay together, they came back to see each other every year for many, many years. I think the next 30 years, they always visited each other, looked after each other, kept an eye on each other. But they actually said we have to follow what the Buddha taught, and they went in different directions to teach the Dhamma for the good of everyone. And Luang Por Buddha always encouraged the monks to contemplate the body. He said the day he was ordained, he was given the 5 meditation objects that you gain as a Buddhist monk. Contemplate hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin. He said he contemplated them until he had no more attachment to his body, no more lust, no more anger. So he'd always teach that. He said, these are your 5 best teachers. And he's always grateful to be ordained. He said at his ordination there were 25 monks sitting in the quorum of monks for the ordination ceremony. He said, every one of those monks I will be eternally grateful to, because they allowed me to come into the Sangha and become a Buddhist monk. So he spent the rest of his life practicing gratitude to those 25 monks, he said. And he moved around Thailand. As I said, he visited a lot of the well-known meditation masters because he loved to visit good monks, talk about Dhamma with them. And I always loved this photo. When I was a young monk, there was a photo when he came to Ajahn Chah's monastery. He came on a bus and he brought lots of people with him. He'd always bring lay supporters with him wherever he went to see these good monks, so they get a chance to meet arahants and enlightened monks. He arrived at Ajahn Chah's monastery. Ajahn Chah walked out to meet the bus and got up on the bus and bowed, because Luang Por Buddha was slightly senior, bowed to Luang Por Buddha on his knees. And this picture was taken, one of these few pictures where Luang Por Chah is bowing to a visiting senior monk. A very beautiful picture. He also visited the famous monk who is considered to be a bodhisattva, Kruba Sivichai, who built all the monasteries and pagodas in northern Thailand around Chiang Mai. Kruba Sivichai was falsely accused of wrongdoing and imprisoned for 2 years. And everyone felt that was an injustice. It was done by people who were jealous of him. He wasn't actually wrong. And Luang Por Buddha respected him and went to visit him to show respect, give him support. And when he went to visit, as is normal, he wasn't wearing his second robe. Like here we have the second robe on the shoulder. The day he went to visit Kruba Sivichai, who was under house arrest, you might call it, or you might call it monastic arrest. He wasn't wearing this second robe, he was just wearing his normal robe. And he went in to bow to Kruba Sivichai, who knew Luang Por Buddha was an enlightened monk. And he said, "Oh, you're coming here dressed like a poor man. You shouldn't. You're a rich man," meaning rich in Dhamma, you're enlightened. "You should wear your second robe over your shoulder, because that's the sign that you're a rich, well-practiced, enlightened monk." So he said, always wear your second robe, your sangati, over your shoulder. So from that day on, he always would wear it whenever he went to visit other monks. And one of the reasons he visited Kruba Sivichai, who was under house arrest, was because he himself had also been falsely accused with Luang Por Song earlier in their life. Because in that era, there was a certain division between study monks, who studied the texts, the suttas, the Abhidhamma, and the meditation monks, who often didn't study so much and weren't so skilled in Pali and the text. The division was quite strong, differentiated. There's a little bit of Sometimes there'd be some criticism of each group would criticize the other. And at one point, Luang Por Song, Luang Por Buddha were accused of teaching without foundation, meaning they didn't have a good foundation in their studies of the suttas, but at the same time, we believe they were arahants. So it's a strange kind of conundrum here. The arahant is being told that he doesn't have a foundation for teaching. Anyway, it was investigated by the Sangharaja, the chief monk of Thailand, who was a very wise monk, and said, this is spurious, it's a false accusation. These two are very good monks, so it was kind of dismissed. Anyway, the accusation was made, so they were sympathetic to Kruba Sivijay, who had the same sort of problem. It's a different era, this is like 80 years ago, something like that. Anyway, eventually he settled in a place called Singburi and built his monastery there and lived there. That's when I went to visit him, and he also visited Ajahn Chah. He came to Ajahn Chah's funeral, and it was so crowded and confused, and unfortunately the police who are running the parking and the receiving of all the cars into the monastery, there's 1 million people turned up. His car wasn't allowed into Ajahn Chah's funeral, so they had to drive back. So it was a terrible mistake. So afterwards we had to go and say sorry to him for that mistake. It wasn't intentional, it was just a very confusing, busy day. And somebody didn't get the message that Luang Por Buddha was in a van trying to get to Luang Por Chah's funeral, so he didn't make it in, unfortunately. I also visited him on his birthday, and travelling around Thailand, sometimes go and visit Luang Por Buddha, and as I said, he was this skinny little monk. Last time I visited him, he was like 99 years old. He's sitting on his bed, very white. And in later years, he developed this way of blessing people. He would people would give him prickly heat powder, which is very popular in Thailand in the old days. And you sprinkle it on you to help remove sweat and keep you smelling nice when you're very hot and sweaty. So he'd bless the whole bottle of prickly heat powder and then give it to people, and then they'd spread it on themselves and feel both cool physically and cool in the mind because they were blessed. And sometimes he would bless them. So he himself was always covered in this talcum powder, prickly heat powder. He's always white. He's white-skinned anyway. He's very white with all the powder. And he'd sit there with his eyes twinkling, very peaceful, very happy. So the last thing I ever asked him, I said, "How are you feeling, Luang Por?" And he said, "Oh, today I'm feeling very cool." It was a very hot day. His monastery was very hot. But anyway, that day he said he was feeling very cool. So that's the true meaning of the word cool. Nowadays everyone says, "Oh, this is cool, that's cool." That's not the true meaning of the word cool. The true meaning of the word cool means the mind that is no longer got defilements in it, the mind of Nibbana. So he became a monk at the age of 28. He became enlightened at the age of 32, and he lived till he was 101. So almost 70 years enlightened monk. That's why thousands of people would go to see him and make offerings and listen to his Dhamma. Sometimes they'd just go and see him to receive the 5 precepts. He would only give a tiny little talk, but he'd give the 5 precepts, and people would say, receive the 5 precepts from this arahant, now I've got to really keep them. He'd really inspire people to practice the Dhamma. So anyway, he made a huge contribution to Buddhism in Thailand. I have fond memories of him, many other people do. One of those monks that you feel happy to have met, and he was good friends with Ajahn Chah, really respected Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Chah respected him. So maybe I'll leave that tonight, gone on a bit about Luang Por Buddha, but we'll finish there.